Physics video and such. Yay. I've done it before, actually. A documentary, The Mysteries of Quantum Physics, Albert Einstein's Nightmare. This guy I don't like much. You know, he's one of these quantum biologists. I don't even think he can justify the quantum physics, let alone justify the quantum biology. And again, it's not the word quantum that's the problem. It's what they have made this word into. And that's the irritating part. Quantum doesn't mean fundamental physics or elemental particle physics. It doesn't mean something to do with quantifying an indestructible bit or some kind of notion like that. It has to do with this mushy stuff. Doesn't really exist as stuff. Stuff isn't stuff. Stuff is ghostly stuff. It's ghost stories, really is. Which is no better than fables and nursery rhymes. And it's nursery rhyme physics. So anyway, we're at the, I remember in the past I did do him throwing these little silly balls very poorly, and the, you know, erectile telescope, and you know, the whole production of this, whatever, the production of this kind of physics, which is really quite annoying. And so I'm just going to re-emphasize some points probably that I've made before, but maybe I'll make them better. Just because my own vision is better about where all this went wrong. And you know, I didn't have phrases before like it's the simplest pattern that can be called a pattern. On, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. Simplest. And I didn't have kind of arguments about what you know, even uses a little bit in there about the fact that our cast shadow has a fuzzy edge. You know, and this is a quantum effect, and you know, there's no conversation about the fact that we see atmospheric effects all the time, and the very fact that we can't just look into the sky and see the stars during the day isn't for any other reason than because the atmosphere is scattering the light. If the atmosphere wasn't there, you would be able to see the stars. The sun would do its little thing over here, and there would be no bleeding of the light. It wouldn't destroy your vision as it does during the day, and it's just the atmosphere that's doing that. So the absence of an atmosphere will permit you to see the sky as it really is, which is black and has little stars in it. You know, that's its natural condition. Anyway, so but none of that context is ever provided in these documentaries. There's no real examination of the subject, and so I'm just going to point out how these are just superficial justifications for expansive and elaborate conclusions drawn that do suspend reason. They're just not reasonable leaps in terms of way overstepping the evidence, and overstepping it for what reason? Again, this, if you're really after the truth, it just seems like it wasn't the truth they're after. They're after what's on the other shore, and they're going to jump there, and they're going to find a reason to justify the jump. That kind of thing. So anyway, so we're doing the dramatic scenery thing. We're playing 1920s music, doing a little bit of whatever, background atmospherics, because it's physics, and you can't do physics straight up. You can't drink it straight. You got to put lots of sugar and lots of crap in it to make it consumable. Unfortunately, apparently that's what scientists think.
Experiment that wasn't even about light. It was about the particles that make electricity.
Alright, the particles that make electricity. So now we're talking about electrons. They don't make electricity. They're victims of electricity, just like everything else. And electricity is a force, and it's a conversion of force into a movement that we can detect. But again, it's a byproduct. Everything's byproducts. Nothing creates anything. It's all just conversions.
In the mid-1920s...
I don't know, this could be louder, I think. should be louder. So I'll try to make it louder appropriately. Bearing.
An experiment was carried out at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey in America, which uncovered something entirely unexpected about electrons.
I happen to be in New Jersey in America, so isn't that not incredibly interesting? But it just happens to be true.
Now, at the time, it was accepted without question that electrons were these tiny lumps of matter.
Yes, everything was accepted without question. That's probably the whole problem here, is that everything's always got to be accepted without question. Every religion always, my God is God, and we're sure, and I'm confident, and I'll kill you. And it's all this way over-the-top bullshit based on very little evidence. And that's the part that's really flawed here, is that everybody's so damn confident, and they're confident based on very little evidence.
Small but solid particles like miniature billiard balls.
Right, now I don't know whether everybody thought that or not. I mean, I just don't know if that's what they really thought. So, yeah, I don't know. You say so. That's what everybody thought. I don't know if everybody thought that.
In the experiment, they fired a beam of electrons at a crystal and watched how they scattered. Now, that's entirely equivalent to taking a beam...
It's not entirely equivalent, but okay, so this is an excuse to get to the two-slit experiment. So the crystal is a diffraction device, lines in the crystal, so it will, well, he's going to say it. So
electrons, say, from an electron gun, and firing it at a screen with two slits in it, so that the electrons pass through the slits and hit another screen at the back.
Right, so all this drama here, and this is already known from Newton's time. So this is the joke here. These are physicists. They're supposed to be informed and knowledgeable and all that kind of stuff, and Newton's rings had been around for hundreds of years, and this is a known phenomenon. You don't need two slits. All you need is one small aperture, and you will create an on-off, on-off, on-off pattern. And the only distinction between this pattern and that pattern is the fact that the center is much brighter if you use one opening. And that seems kind of logical because no electrons can go in the center if there's two openings. So that sort of seems intuitively reasonable that you could deduce, okay, that the center would be less bright if you're blocking the center. And that's sort of what happens in the experiment. But there's no examination of this experiment. I mean, no conversation about the fact that as you randomly, again, these are randomly fired, so they hit all these, across here evenly. No conversation about whether the electron goes close to a surface or in between the two surfaces, far away from a surface or close to a surface. No conversation, no mention of surface ever in any of these videos, and yet that is the key thing that's happening when you make an aperture smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Quite obviously what's happening is the amount of area to surface, that ratio is changing, okay, by a factor. And it will eventually, as you close it all the way, go to a factor where it's all surface and no opening. But the point is you're doing this at minimum. You have this pi relationship between the circumference and the area, and there's a clear difference in terms of the ratio. The bigger you get, you're 4 times as much open space. And it's why isn't this part of the conversation? I mean, it seems an obvious thing that's changing. So you're trying to figure out what changes between this and this. And it seems the obvious thing that's changing is that relationship between the likelihood of being close to the surface. That's the key word here, close to the surface. So being within a millimeter. So a 1 millimeter is going to mean something much different at a very small aperture than it means at a big aperture. So I guess that's a better way for me to say it. A millimeter means something significantly different in terms of your distance from a surface, and your likelihood to be distant from a surface. And that's the difference. That's all the difference.
What the Bell scientists found shocked the physics world to the core.
Right, okay, so this is a shocking thing from which nobody can come up with any better explanation, okay, than to propose an idea that seems just too incredible. And again, it is too incredible. If you just stop doing this double slit thing, just do the single slit thing, and then try to use your silly explanation. Because your silly explanation just can't work. There's nothing to split photons in two.
To understand why, consider a similar experiment with water waves.
Right, now if they considered this honestly, if they said, okay, let's look at other wave phenomenon and see if there's a similarity. And then they could, if they did that at all honestly, then they'd say, oh look, there's a similarity when there's two openings to water waves, and yet when there's one opening, there's no similarity. And that would tell them something. That would tell them that maybe they're not on the right track.
I've set up a simple experiment. I have a water ripple tank placed on top of an overhead projector. I have a generator producing waves that pass through two narrow gaps. The projector beams the image of the waves onto the back wall. You can see as the waves come in from the left and squeeze through the two gaps, they spread out on the other side and interfere with each other. What this means...
Right, and nothing like light. The spread out part has nothing to do with any light phenomenon ever noticed. There's nothing about light that seems very spread out. It always lands as a point particle and travels in a straight line.
Is that when you get the crest from one wave meeting the crest from another, they add up to make a higher wave. But when the crest from one meets a trough, they cancel out.
And he didn't mention the trough meeting trough because that wouldn't fit into this game they're playing, because that would mean there's this, the trough and trough is in the same exact line as the crest meeting crest. So there's two kinds of constructive interference and one kind of destructive interference. So again, it's not exactly being fair to the pattern. And then it really doesn't have anything to do with the actual pattern. If you do this experiment with light, you won't end up with what he's going to show. You'll end up with two patterns superimposed on each other. A big pattern and then little pattern inside of the big pattern. So they're not even describing the two-slit experiment accurately, and then on top of that, they're totally ignoring the fact that the very same phenomenon is taking place with one slit. So again, that's the context here. The factual context that's totally ignored because they're selling a religion. They're explaining to you why God exists. And the God exists, and they're coming up with these stories. So, well, didn't you hear the story about the dead guy he rose? Jesus did. And then you hear the story about him walking on water. And they take out of the context the story where, you know, I don't know, he stole something, or, you know, he did something else terribly human.
This gives rise to these characteristic lines leading to the signature wave pattern.
Right, the signature wave pattern. On, off, on, off. On. The simplest pattern that can be called a pattern. You can't make something and call it a pattern that's any simpler than that pattern. And yet they're going to say that every time that pattern shows up, we must conclude it's wave interference. Everybody says he's God, so he must be God. I mean, it's just not very logical.
Bands of light and dark.
Exactly. The same bands of light and dark you'll get with a single opening. So you'll get exactly the same bands, and the only difference is this center one will be bigger and brighter. But all these will still exist. Keep that in mind.
Whenever you see these light and dark bands, the signature wave pattern, you know without doubt that you've got wave-like behavior.
Okay, you know without doubt you have wave-like behavior. So that's kind of wishy-washy, right? So you know without a doubt you have a like. You know, so that's like, you know without a doubt he could have murdered somebody. You know, this isn't very scientific or logically strict or reasonable kind of rhetoric for physics. It's not a very scientific statement. You know without a doubt it could be a wave. Well, gee, it could not be also. So, la 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 la. Music, scenery, do 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 do. It's all part of physics. Trust me.
So, guess what they saw in New Jersey? Now it seemed that firing electrons, tiny solid particles, through the tip.
Right, okay, let's understand what an electron is. An electron is a charged particle. It's very important. Electrons hate going in straight lines unless they're moving from through a charge, from a cathode to an anode. This is how they would shoot electrons, is they would, you know, pretend to put a charge in front of it and say, go ahead, try to hit me. And then they take the charge away and the electron would keep going. But that's how they would get electrons to go someplace, is they'd head them for a charge and then the electron would just keep going. But electrons, you know, you can bend them really easily. So like I said, the back of TVs, they used to have the cathode ray tubes, had a big giant coil of wire that created magnetism to move the electrons, all very dramatically bend them. I mean, just bend their path incredibly. So they're very, very susceptible to any kind of charge changing their movement. They don't have to bang into something, they can be moved by force. Photons can't be moved by force. You can't put photons in an accelerator and accelerate them. You have to use something like an electron or a proton. You have to use one of those nuclear bits, the big bits. But they're not particles. They're not fundamental anything. They're made of stuff. Quanta. See, they don't really understand what quantum physics is. Quantum physics is force physics. This is force quantum. Quantum light moves the speed of light. Magnetism moves the speed of light. Gravity moves the speed of light. They're all force. Okay, just given different names because they have slightly different properties. Radio waves are very different than X-rays and visible light, yet they're on the same spectrum. And physicists might agree that they're all the same thing. Well, what they haven't realized is magnetism is the same thing and gravity is the same thing. All the things moving the speed of light are the same thing. They're just subtly different in terms of the period between their arrival, frequency, and polarization. So two little things they change, like put their hair in a bun and I don't know, skip instead of walk or run.
Gaps produced exactly the same kind of pattern, bands of light.
On-off pattern, which is just a diffraction pattern. So this is what it was originally called. It was diffraction. Something changes its angle. So like a prism, you can separate the band of light, based on its frequency. The same kind of phenomenon, essentially. The amount or degree of your bend is going to depend on the frequency of the light. And that will tell you how close or far away these bars will be. So if this was blue light, there's a certain separation. If it's red light, then they'll be closer to, the bands will be thinner and they'll be closer together. If it's blue light, and if it's red light, it's more spread out. And this can be described mechanically. It doesn't need phantasmagorical explanation. Electrons change the direction they move based on the field they're in, and it seems quite logical if the electron is being bent, then any emission of a photon is going to be in that bent direction. I think kind of obviously.
First, light, for a long time believed to be a wave, was found to sometimes behave like particles. And now,
so that's the Einstein part. So the previous to this part of the video was sort of describing Einstein and the thing he got the Nobel Prize for, which is the the photoelectric effect, which is shining light on a metal. The metal creates a current, an electric current, and more specifically can induce potential for the movement of current in the idea of a photoresistor, which was also invented in New Jersey. And yeah, New Jersey is good at that kind of stuff.
electrons, for a long time believed to be particles, were behaving like waves. But it was that.
Okay, so again, let's just recognize electrons are different than photons, but electrons produce photons. So this is a huge connection between these two things. So logically, if you kind of understand that matter would have field energy around it, so now we can even go back to the physics girl video previously, where she said the word halo. You know, I have a halo of heat. And the image, the infrared image, was kind of poor at demonstrating that. You did see a little bit of a yellow or orange line around certain areas of her, and it would be that area where your body is excreting a bunch of warm moisture. Okay, so there's this little area around you where the atmosphere has been heated, and the atmosphere is emitting infrared radiation, like a light bulb, though. It's not a halo, it's lit, so to speak. There's radiation coming off of it, and you can see the radiation. But the halo is the idea that around our surfaces in an atmosphere, we're stimulating the atmosphere. We're changing the atmosphere around us. We're oozing atoms and ions and electrons and all kinds of stuff is being oozed from the matter we possess. And it's in that field that you have to think, in that context, that you think about the two-slit experiment and realize that matter isn't some solid thing where there's an edge to the matter and this side is all matter and this side is all something else. There's always a border, and that border is an atomic border. All right, and there can be all kinds of electrons that are floating, that are magnetically still drawn to the protons, but aren't technically part of the atoms. And those free electrons, charge, are perfectly capable of having light hit them, and they're perfectly capable of being accelerated by that light, and they're perfectly capable of moving in non-straight lines, and therefore re-emitting a photon in a diffracted or new angle, i.e. the pattern. Depending on how close you are to the surface, you will be diffracted at a higher angle, because the electron that emitted these photons, so the photon goes in, hits an electron, and a new photon comes out, and that new photon comes out at a new angle of trajectory. And the closer you are to the surface, the more you're likely to be bent, higher angle of diffraction. Another explanation could be that the more electrons you hit, okay, the angle gets multiplied. So let's say the angle is one angle, but if you hit 5 electrons and trying to get through somewhere, each one bending you at 22 degrees, then you could sort of understand that degrees would be just multiplied. And so depending on how many electrons you hit, you would be diffracted more. These are just possible explanations, just physical, realistic, within the realm of a reasonable explanation where you don't have to resort to gremlins, leprechauns, Tinkerbell, which they're going to do.
Actually, stranger than that, the wave pattern wasn't merely some result of the entire beam of electrons. More recently, this experiment has been repeated in labs around the world by firing one electron at a time.
Right. Now what they haven't been able to do, or apparently haven't been willing to do, or haven't been interested enough to do, I still think it's a problem just because of the problem of firing anything straight, is to aim the electrons and aim them at the surfaces and then aim them in between the slits and see if you get a different pattern over here. If you shoot all the electrons right in between the material, what pattern do you get? If you shoot all the electrons right next to the surface, what kind of pattern do you get? That will tell you something. Very important.
The slits onto the screen.
So this is for dramatic
First,
effect.
each electron seems to land randomly on the screen. But gradually a pattern forms.
Right, isn't that fascinating? Now, like I said, the logical conclusion is to say, okay, so it's a phenomenon that's happening to each electron. Each electron is experiencing this circumstance that decides where it ends up. So instead of just analyzing and saying, well, maybe the difference is where you end up going in here. So depending on where you end up going through one of these slits, close to the surface, far away from the surface, will dictate whether you end up in near here or out here. And that's what's deciding the fate of the electron. Where in this area it went through. That seems a rational place to investigate. If you're looking for the murderer, this looks like a viable bit of investigation. But no conversation, not even a conversation. Again, never even the word surface will ever come up in any conversation about this. They will never talk about these being four surfaces and that these gaps are variably distant from the surface.
The signature wave pattern. Let me
Again, the signature on-off pattern.
quite clear about just how weird this is. Remember from the wave tank experiment where the
Again, double slit wave tank experiment. If they take out this clump here and do the single slit, they won't have an interference pattern and they'll have nothing at all similar to Newton's rings. They won't be able to create Newton's rings with a wave tank. Alright, and so they're not describing the phenomenon that's taking place with light. And the only way they have fixed that is to invent a fake principle called Huygens, named after the guy who was all for this wave stuff, and he knew there was a crisis and they had to fix it. And so he invented a fake theory that each wave that comes in here creates a bunch of an infinite number, he even said. An infinite number. That's their principle. An infinite number of little wavelets that are creating the next wave front. And the principle is applied nowhere else in physics except to fix the math on the single slit experiment. This is a fact. This is the facts of what they have premised this thing called quantum physics on. They've premised it on things they glued on. Okay, it's a glued on unicorn horn. Alright, that's what Huygens is. It's a glued on horn. It's as fake as you can get. It's not a real principle. They apply it in no other part of physics anywhere. You only hear about Huygens when it comes to single slit diffraction. That's the only utility it has. It only is good for gluing unicorn horns onto goats. And that's its only purpose, is to make this rational. This nonsense. And that's it. I mean, it's a fraud. They should be able to detect it's a fraud. They're supposed to be physicists. They're supposed to be the smartest people in the universe. And they're telling me they can't see a glued-on horn. They thought it was real. It made sense to them when they heard about Huygens and they heard that it's a principle. And they noticed that it's not used anywhere else in physics, but that doesn't matter. But the very idea of a principle to a physicist made out of an infinite number of something, that didn't even give it away. I'm supposed to believe that? This is a religion. Okay, they want Jesus to be God, and that's why they're selling it so frickin' hard.
signature wave pattern only exists because each wave passes through both slits and then its two pieces interfere with each other. But here, every individual electron, each single particle, is passing alone through the slits before it hits the screen.
Right. So they have to make up some idea that, well, how does it interfere with it? How does it have interference if there's no other photons to interfere with or other electrons to interfere with? And then, so their conclusion was, well, the interference must be right. So interference must be happening. So let's make another photon somehow. And that's all they did. So they just invented this nutty idea that an electron is heading for this right here. We know electrons will hit this barrier. So they obviously don't split in half and go to the target and do all this splitting stuff. They hit one spot. But they're saying to you that somehow the electrons know when they're going to go through a slit that what they really have to do is turn into two electrons and then reconfigure themselves into two new identities, and then have those two identities interact with each other and then become a one back here again. So they do that elaborate fantasy thinking because they are insisting that it has to be interference. There can't be any other explanation. And they don't even say the word surface. They don't even think about gaps. They don't think about anything else being possibly an explanation. They don't consider it. They don't even give it a thought. You know, they just say we must fix the Jesus theory.
And yet each single electron is still contributing to the signature wave pattern. Each electron has to be behaving like a wave.
Again, it has to be. It has to be. There's no alternative explanation. Yes, there is. It's an electron. Okay, so again, let's explain that the electrons are doing something different than the photons are doing. It's the same pattern, but it's the same obstacle. And the obstacle really just has to do with charge. So again, the electrons are hitting electrons, okay, and doing exactly the same thing as the photon would do. And the electrons are field sensitive. So again, they can be diffracted without even having to interact with another electron. But it's like traveling the field lines around a magnet. You can understand they have bends in them. And it's those bends that are going to force electrons not to travel a straight line.
To explain this strange result, Niels Bohr and his colleagues created quantum mechanics.
So again, they took something, quantum electrodynamics, the relationship between photons and electrons, which quantum electrodynamics was an effort to explain, and now they're going to convert it into something called quantum mechanics, which really is premised on the theory that there's this Heisenberg principle that light and electrons don't have any location, that they're amorphous things that don't have structure, and that they can essentially dematerialize, do something in some dematerialized state, and then somehow materialize as if they were a school of fish or some kind of solid thing. So the idea is there's a school of fish, for the electron anyway, and then it's coming to a barrier, and then it decides to fall apart as a school of fish, and all the individual fish go out and do whatever they want, and then they somehow come back and figure out where they're supposed to have been going. Somehow the fish know where to go. You know. No.
A crazy theory of light and matter that embraced contradiction.
Right, okay, so there you go right there. Crazy theory that embraced contradiction. You might as well say silly fable that embraced fun. And that's physics now. And so we're going to, for 100 years, we're going to found physics on a fable. A fun fable.
I didn't care that it was almost impossible to understand.
Right, don't care that it's not reasonable. Just have the trial anyway, convict the guy, because this isn't really about the truth. It's just about we want a good story. And particles aren't fun.
As Niels Bohr himself said, Anyone who isn't shocked by quantum theory hasn't understood it.
Right. So again, right on its face, you say, well, you come up with a shockingly bizarre explanation, an extraordinary explanation. The UFOs came to Earth wearing size 14 Bruno Mollies, and Nicole Simpson said a nasty word that they didn't like by accident, and they decided to cut her head off, and they said, well, we'll get that Goldman guy while we're at it also, and we'll make it look like OJ did it, and we'll cut his hand while he's sleeping, so it looks like he did it. I'm just saying, that's all they're doing here. This is a mockery of a trial. They haven't tried the evidence here properly. They haven't fairly sought the truth. This is a banana republic physics.
So, viewers, I'm going to take our tiny electron and use it to delve deep into the heart of reality.
So again, this is how you get to reality, as you tell unicorn stories. And again, let's just be sure we understand here, all right, that there's hard evidence of chicanery. Huygens is hard evidence of a desperate effort to deny evidence, to suppress evidence, to make the evidence go away. The evidence that there are no unicorns, the evidence that they're never born on Earth. And they essentially destroyed that evidence by gluing horns on baby goats with Huygens. The single slit diffraction blows all this up. It destroys all of this nonsense just spoken about, because there's no way to contrive a second photon. There's no way to contrive a second electron to create the second wave that's going to interfere with the first wave. So all you have is an electron passing near a surface or an electron passing far away from a surface. That's all you have. And you're saying, okay, why is there a difference? Why does the electron behave differently when it goes in between the two slits and differently from when it goes right next to one of the surfaces of the slits? That's the question to answer. They didn't try to answer the true question. Instead, they started gluing horns on baby goats. And now they're selling the lie. I mean, 100 years later, they're still selling the same snake oil. The same crappy recipe of let's not talk about any of the evidence that indicates this is all a crock of shit. Let's avoid all of that. Let's whitewash it all away. We'll just keep saying things like it's the most reliable mathematics in the universe. It's proven itself correct zillions of times. It's done everything. It cleaned your house for you. You know it did. It painted it. It did everything. It made rockets go to the moon. No, it didn't do any of that shit. It made your iPod. No, it didn't. You know.
And yes, prepare to be shocked, because this is the only way to explain what we observe.
All right, this is the only way. I mean, it's not even close to the only way. And again, it's totally dependent on things that are overtly fraudulent. Principles that you never use ever anywhere else but in one circumstance. How can you call that a principle? Huygens.
When a single electron travels through the slits and hits the screen.
What the hell is wrong with my mouse? Yeah, I don't know.
Quantum mechanics says this: we can't describe what's traveling as a physical object. All we can talk about are the chances of where the electron might be. This wave of chance somehow travels through both slits, producing interference just like the water wave. Then, when it hits the screen, what was just the ghostly possibility of an electron...
There, well, you probably can't see it, but it's a little tiny dot right there. So yes, the little dot came out of here. They know that because if they look and they'll see it hit right there, they'll see it hit things without being two of them. They'll just be one. They'll see it hit surfaces and it's just one thing. They know one thing came out of here. They know one thing lands over here. And they've just made up all of this crap about what's taking place in between. And it's all made up of, let's not pay any attention to these surfaces. Let's just ignore the surfaces exist. Let's ignore the fact that the electron will travel close or far away from the surface. Let's pretend all of those facts have no meaning in this experiment, when that's the fundamental variable in the experiment. That is the variable. The only thing that's varying in this experiment is where the electron will go inside of this gap. How close it will be to a surface and how far away it will be from a surface. That is the only variable in this experiment, and totally ignored by physicists. The single variable, and they ignore it, so they can propagate a phantasmagorically silly explanation of reality.
Mysteriously becomes real. Let me try and capture just how weird this is.
Right. This is like a preposterous example of capturing anything anywhere close to similar. So as bad as the wave experiment is, in the sense that they ignore the single opening flat wave, water wave experiment. They don't show you it because it's not explanatory. It doesn't defend their theory. It in fact is evidence against their theory. So they don't show it to you. So even the water waves is a flawed demonstration and a flawed analogy. Light isn't water. Light isn't a wave traveling through water. Water waves are very different than what light is doing, or magnetism is doing, or gravity is doing. The things moving the speed of light. If I take all the things moving the speed of light, none of them appear to be doing anything wavy. Especially things like gravity and magnetism. The only time they have any wave function is when we give it frequency. Okay, like an electromagnet or a transformer. And that principle of turning it on and off is another, that has another physical explanation. But clearly a magnet isn't a frequency. Clearly it's not perpetrating a wave function of some kind.
With an analogy, if I spin this coin,
all this drama.
Every time it's spinning, it's a blur. I can't tell if it's heads or tails.
It's neither one, okay? So there's no point in even talking about whether it's heads or tails. And yes, obviously there's going to be a point where it starts to lean, and then it's going to be presumable where it's going to end up, because it's not, there's no energy to pop it back up, to respin it. So you could deduce what it's going to be. But again, this has nothing to do with this experiment at all. This is a completely non-applicable, non-relevant phenomenon, the spinning of a coin. This has nothing to do with why there's a set of rules regarding where electrons end up. Those rules, again, as pointed out, are an on-off pattern. They're not just the flipping of a coin. It's more complicated than two choices.
But if I stop it, I force it to decide, and it's heads.
Yeah, you didn't force it to decide, you just expedited the decision. It was already heading for the decision. The head part was already inevitable because it was leaning. So again, this oversimplification, even when they're using analogies that aren't even analogous. And this is somehow healthy, proper, good physics. It's worth 3,000 thumbs up to 153 thumbs down, which these are probably just Christians who thumb down any physics video ever made. And so this is what you're going to endorse, is this is good education. No, this is horrible propaganda.
So before, it was sort of not heads or tails, but a mixture of both.
Well, it really never was any of that, and we all know that if you know anything about physics. You know there was no, it's a mixture of anything. Okay, it had a certain inevitability, especially spinning a coin. That's really going to end up with the same result each time, depending on how the coin was positioned when you spun it. So this one is like a tic-tac-toe argument. Why don't you use tic-tac-toe as an example? You know, and just pretend you don't know that whoever goes first wins.
As soon as I've stopped it, I've forced it to make up its mind. This is what Bohr and his supporters claimed was happening with our electrons.
Right. So again, there's just no argument to be made about the fact that, you know, they didn't have didn't have much information. They see a phenomenon that's spooky, strange to them. Why is it doing that is the question. Instead of really doing the physics thing, the scientist thing, the investigator thing, to answer that question, they came up with a notion of an idea that, well, again, I can't even make sense of it anyway. I can't make sense of their first perception of light being a wave, because it's nonsensical, because it doesn't spread, and waves spread. And so they were going in with a silly notion of what a light was, and then on top of that add this sillier idea that now we will make this thing capable of cloning itself, okay, and doing probability math, and make the simplest thing in the universe, the smallest mass known, and give it all these complex properties. And that's doing good physics.
In a sense, as it spins, the coin is both heads and tails. Similarly, the electron's wave of chance passes through both slits, two paths at the same time.
Again, you really you can't see how preposterous that is. As look, physics is about finding answers that are simpler, because you know that that's the tendency. The simple things make the complex things don't make simple things, but you know that the rudimentary function gets down to simple mechanics, not more complicated mechanics. And we have searched for the simple